My name is Claire. I'm 62, a retired public school teacher, and I've lived in Portland, Oregon for most of my life. I never imagined that the moment I lost my husband would be the same moment I realized I'd lost my son too. David died on a Tuesday morning. We were sitting at the kitchen table. The sun was coming through the window just like it always did, and he was teasing me about buying the wrong kind of creamer again. He tapped his spoon against the rim of his mug and told me I'd no real guilt if he dropped dead from that powdered nonsense, and then, before I could roll my eyes, he was gone. No warning, no gasp, just a flicker in his eyes like something inside him had unplugged, and his body slumped forward so suddenly I thought he was joking. But then his spoon clattered to the floor, and the way his neck hung, too loose, too still, it told me everything. I called 911 and tried to stay calm. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone steady, but I followed every instruction the operator gave me. I did the chest compressions. I whispered his name. I begged, but deep down, I already knew. I knew when I touched his hand that it was already starting to cool. I knew from the way his head had tilted like gravity had given up on holding him upright. I knew, and I hated that I knew, because it meant there was no miracle coming. When the paramedics arrived, I moved out of the way. I heard phrases like massive cardiac event and DNR confirmed, and all I could do was nod. I watched strangers cover the man I'd spent 40 years with, and the sound of the zipper on that black bag is something I don't think I'll ever forget. After they left, the house didn't feel like a house anymore. It felt like the shell of one. I sat in silence for what could have been minutes or hours, until I remembered Jacob, our only son. I reached for my phone with fingers that barely worked and dialed his number. It rang 5 times. When he finally answered, his voice sounded like he was halfway through a bite of food. I told him, just 5 words. David's gone. He collapsed. He's dead. There was a pause on his end, and then he said, casual as you please, "We've got brunch plans, Mum. Can we talk tomorrow?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. I don't even remember ending the call. My hand just lowered the phone like it had lost its strength, and I sat there, staring at the spot where my husband had died, listening to the hum of a refrigerator that suddenly seemed too loud. It was in that silence that the truth hit me harder than any funeral ever could. David was gone, and so was the version of Jacob I used to believe in. That day, I buried my husband, and something deeper. I buried the illusion that love guarantees loyalty. He was smiling when it happened. David had just finished teasing me about the powdered creamer I always bought by mistake. He gave that same half laugh he always did, the one that rattled gently in his chest, and said I was going to feel real guilt if he ever dropped dead mid-sip. Then his hand twitched. The spoon in his fingers tapped once against the mug, then slipped and clattered onto the table. His smile didn't fat. It froze. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in confusion, like his body had forgotten what to do next. He looked at me, and I knew before he even moved again. I called his name, once then again, louder. When he didn't answer, I dropped the butter knife I'd been using and reached across the table. His body felt heavy. Not limp exactly, just wrong. I ran around the table and pulled him upright, but his head lolled against my shoulder. My fingers reached for the phone before my brain caught up. I hit 911 with a kind of desperate precision, like it would somehow reverse time. The woman on the line spoke clearly, too clearly, as she guided me through CPR, my palms pressed against his chest like they were made of wood. I counted compressions. I breathed when she told me to, but it was all pretend. Somewhere inside me I already knew it was over. The man who held my hand every night, The man who still laughed at his own jokes. He wasn't coming back. The paramedics arrived too late to matter. They moved quickly, decisively, but their eyes said everything. Massive cardiac arrest. DNR on file. They didn't ask for permission, just facts. I nodded at words I didn't understand and watched as they zipped his body into a bag, like closing a suitcase for the last trip he'd never take. The house turned silent once they left. The air felt too still, like it was holding its breath with me. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, eyes locked on the coffee cup, still half full, still warm. It felt disrespectful to pour it out. I called Jacob. He didn't pick up right away. When he did, it was like I'd interrupted something light-hearted, something unimportant. I told him David had collapsed. I told him his father was gone. He paused, just for a second, then said they had plans. It's Megan's birthday, Mum. We've got brunch. Can we talk tomorrow? I didn't answer. I couldn't. It was like he'd spoken in a language I no longer understood. I hung up before he could say anything else that might shatter me worse. I sat back down in David's chair, staring at the table like it held the explanation I needed. It didn't. That night, I didn't cook. I didn't change clothes. I went to bed in the same sweater I wore when I lost him. His phone was on the nightstand. I picked it up, hoping for something. A message, a missed call. And there it was. One missed call to Jacob. No voicemail. No answer. He'd tried. David had called him the night before. Maybe he knew something wasn't right. Maybe he just wanted to hear his son's voice. Either way, he didn't get to. Jacob didn't answer, and now there was no second chance. The day of the funeral felt like watching a movie in a language I didn't speak. People moved around me, hugged, whispered condolences, but none of it landed. Not really. I stood near the casket, both feet planted, but nothing kept me upright except stubbornness. Friends came, neighbours, old co-workers, but Jacob didn't, not even a text. Megan picked up the phone the night before when I tried to confirm if he was coming. She told me he was still deciding, because they had booked a weekend getaway and the cancellation fees were high. She said it like that mattered more than showing up to say goodbye to the man who raised him, the man who sat up through fevers, who drove across town to drop off a forgotten soccer cleat, who worked overtime so Jacob could go to college without debt. I didn't argue. I didn't beg, I just said goodbye and hung up the phone with a finality that felt like closing a door I wasn't sure I'd ever open again. For the service, I scanned every face that entered the chapel, hoping, even when I knew better. The whispers started before we began. Where's Jacob? Is he okay? Was there a delay? No, he just didn't come. And that silence felt louder than any eulogy I could have given. I spoke anyway. I stood behind the podium and told the story of the man I loved. My voice only cracked once. I kept it steady because David deserved that. He deserved to be remembered without my sorrow stealing the moment. I ended my speech with the story of how he proposed, with a crossword puzzle, a simple, sweet memory that made a few people laugh through their tears. Then I walked away from the microphone, sat down and stared at the empty row where my son should have been. After the reception, someone asked if Jacob had missed his flight. I didn't answer. I just smiled, like it didn't hurt. But it did. It hurt more than I thought possible. Not just the loss of David, but the realization that Jacob had chosen brunch over goodbye. That's the kind of pain that doesn't scream. It settles deep, in places no one can see. That day didn't just take my husband. It revealed the truth about the boy we'd raised. And it broke something in me I'm not sure I'll ever fully repair. The morning after the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to make coffee. The kitchen still smelled faintly like David's cologne, and the chair he always sat in remained exactly where he left it. I stood in the doorway, staring at that chair like it might offer an answer, and then turned toward the hallway instead. His office was neat, exactly how he'd left it, down to the pen sitting perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. I opened the bottom drawer, the one he always kept locked, and pulled out the key he'd taped behind our wedding photo in the closet. He told me once that it was my backup key, in case of an emergency. I guessed this counted. The drawer creaked open, revealing folders lined up like soldiers. Each is labelled, dated, and organised by year. I scanned the tabs until one caught my eye. It was thinner than the rest. Blue. Labelled Nathan, transfers. I sat down with it in my lap, the folder shaking slightly in my hands. Inside were printouts, bank statements, transfer receipts, all from David's personal account, 2,000 here, 3,500 there. A line item marked urgent, Megan Medical. That one stopped me cold. I flipped through the pages, counting the entries. 15 transfers in total, spanning 18 months. No mention, no discussion, no warning. And we never kept secrets. At least I thought we didn't. At the very back of the folder was a folded yellow sheet of paper. Legal pad. David's handwriting, immediately familiar. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling, before I even read the first line. Nathan, this is the second time you've told your mother one thing and done another. I've kept quiet because I wanted to believe you were being honest. But if you lie about Megan's expenses again, or if I find out you've used this money for anything else, I'll cut you off completely. There was no signature, but he didn't need one. It was dated 2 weeks before David died. I sat back in the chair, the paper still in my hand, the numbers swimming in my vision. I tried to remember any sign, any hint that David had been carrying this burden alone. He hadn't said a word. That's what stung the most. Not the money, not even the lies. It was the fact that the man who shared everything with me had chosen silence. To protect me. Or maybe to protect our son. Or maybe he just didn't know how to say it out loud. Lyra is here. Lyra. I placed the letter gently back between the pages. My throat felt dry. My chest as tight. But I didn't cry, not yet. I was too busy trying to understand what it meant, what it all added up to. David had known. He'd tried to stop it, and Jacob had ignored him, just like he had ignored my call the morning David died. That was the moment I stopped looking for an explanation. I started looking for clarity, and what I saw in that folder wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. A decision made again and again. One I had never been invited to see. But now I had, and I couldn't unsee it. I sat at the kitchen table, with the folder still in front of me. The same table where David died just days earlier. His coffee mug was still by the sink, untouched, the ring of dried creamer on the inside clinging like it had something left to say. I didn't move for a long time. I let the silence wrap around me like a second skin. No tears, no anger, just this hollow sort of focus, like everything in me had shifted from grief into something colder. I picked up the mug, still unwashed, and held it in both hands. The ceramic felt solid, real, grounded. I stared at it like it held the answer to how everything had gone so wrong, without me seeing it. Then I placed it back on the counter, turned, and opened the drawer where we kept the batteries. Inside, next to the flashlights and rubber bands, was the voice recorder David had used for his classes when he did guest lectures. I slid it into my cardigan pocket without a second thought. I wasn't sure what I'd record, not yet, but I knew I'd need it. Not because I was planning a war, but because I couldn't trust words alone anymore. Memory had become too fragile. I needed something permanent. Then I made a list. On the back of a grocery receipt, I wrote names. People David had trusted. Our lawyer, Alan. The bank officer he used to call when he needed to confirm a transfer. I wrote down everything I could remember from the folder. Dates, amounts, notes in the margins. By the time I looked up, an hour had passed. Maybe 2. But I wasn't frozen anymore. I had moved. Shifted. From a woman trying to mourn into someone ready to protect what was left. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I couldn't go back to pretending. That part of me had died with David. What was left was quieter, sharper, and very, very clear. They showed up on a Wednesday afternoon, 5 days after the funeral. No call ahead, no apology, just the sound of tires crunching the driveway gravel, and Megan's car idling like she was ready to leave, before the conversation even began. When I opened the door, Jacob was standing there, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, shoulders tight. Behind him, Megan sat in the driver's seat, sunglasses still on, tapping her nails on the steering wheel. I didn't speak. I stepped aside and let him in, not out of warmth but out of curiosity. Jacob followed me into the living room. David's chair sat untouched, still angled the way he always left it after breakfast. I offered coffee out of habit, knowing he would say no. He did. Then he sat down on the edge of the couch like he couldn't decide if he was staying or just pausing on the way to something more important. Megan didn't come in. She stayed out front with the engine running. I noticed the way Jacob kept glancing toward the window, like he was measuring how long he could stay before it got too uncomfortable. I didn't offer small talk. I pressed record on the voice recorder in my cardigan pocket. He started with Mega and thinks I should have come sooner. I waited. Nothing about David. Nothing about how I was doing. Just Megan. I nodded once and let the silence stretch. He shifted, clearly uncomfortable, then added that it was all just bad timing. They had dinner plans that night, a surprise she had arranged. That's when I asked if he knew his father had tried calling him the night before he died. His jaw twitched. A tiny movement, but enough. He said his phone was on silent. He said they were out. I said David wasn't sick. He died at the table, while joking about coffee creamer. His mouth opened to say something, then closed. He rubbed his forehead, like the truth was a headache he couldn't push past. So I handed him the letter. The one David wrote but never sent. He unfolded it, read it quietly, then placed it on the coffee table like it was nothing more than a receipt. He said David didn't mean that. I stared at him. Not angrily, just long enough for the weight to land. Then I said I found the transfers, the rent, the vacation, the 12 grand for Megan's procedure. His voice rose slightly as he said, "Those were loans." I didn't answer. Instead, I said one sentence, the only one I had rehearsed. "I'm not cutting you off. I'm protecting Ava." That stopped him. His eyes dropped. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't defend himself. He just stared at the carpet, like it might explain something he couldn't. Then Megan honked from the car. Jacob stood. He didn't hug me, didn't say goodbye, just nodded like he had been dismissed and walked out. Megan didn't even look at the house when they drove away. I stood at the window for a long time after that, not watching them, watching the reflection of myself in the glass. And I saw a woman who finally understood that love doesn't mean letting yourself be used. It means drawing a line when no one else will. And I had. For Ava, for David, for myself. It came in a plain white envelope, no return address, just my name written in careful block letters, the kind you only see when a child is trying their best to write something perfectly. Inside was a black flash drive, no note, no explanation. I held it in my hand and knew immediately it was from Ava. I sat down at David's desk, the one I hadn't touched since the day I found the folder. My heartbeat slowed and heavy as I plugged the drive into my laptop. Folders popped up on the screen, each one labelled by date. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I opened the first file. It was a recording. Megan's voice, sharp and fast, said that if Ava sides with her grandmother, we'll pull her out of school until she comes to her senses. I stared at the screen, frozen, as Ava's breath caught just before the audio cut out. Then another file, a text message exchange. Megan told Jacob they needed to make sure I wasn't thinking clearly, that if I cracked under pressure, the trust could be restructured. There were video files too. One shaky clip, clearly recorded from behind a bedroom door, showed Megan pacing in the kitchen, whispering into her phone. She said they would play the mental decline card, that grief makes people unstable, that no judge would question their motives if they claimed they were just trying to help me. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, hands trembling on the keyboard. I clicked through file after file, each one a quiet act of courage. A child was listening when the adults thought she wasn't. A child who saw the truth clearly, while the grown-ups tried to twist it into something unrecognizable. At the bottom of it all was a small document, just a few lines. Grandma, I don't know who else to tell. I hear things when they think I'm asleep. I know they're lying. I believe you. I read it 3 times before I could move. This wasn't just a flash drive. It was a shield. Ava had done what no one else had the courage to do. She listened. She watched. She chose to act. I backed up the files twice, one copy for Alan, one for my safe. Then I sat in the dark with the drive in my palm, letting the weight of it settle in my chest. It wasn't about the money anymore. It hadn't been, for a long time. This was about a child who knew what was right, even when the people around her didn't. And in that moment I realized I wasn't just fighting for my own peace, I was fighting to protect hers. Because she believed in me before I knew I still had something left to believe in. The mediation room smelled faintly of lemon polish and quiet judgment. Everything inside was beige. The chairs, the carpet, even the legal pads sitting on the glass table. It was a space designed not to provoke emotion, but to hold it at arm's length. I walked in with Alan at my side. He carried the folder we had prepared together. Inside was everything. The bank transfers, David's letter, the flash drive Ava had given me. I didn't speak as I sat down across from Jacob and Megan. Megan wore a navy blazer too sharp for the occasion. Her hair was pulled back tight, her lips a practiced shade of calm. Jacob looked tired, older than I remembered, eyes darting anywhere but toward me. When the mediator introduced herself, Megan was the first to speak. She launched into her narrative with a well-rehearsed rhythm. Claire is grieving. She's not thinking clearly. She's acting out of pain, not reason. Megan suggested I was unstable, that David's death had left me too fragile to manage decisions like estate planning. I didn't interrupt. I didn't flinch. I waited until she finished, then slid the folder across the table. I said nothing. I let the document speak instead. The mediator opened it and began to read, slowly, carefully, turning each page with growing attention. She read David's letter. She listened to the audio of Jacob admitting the funds were loans, even after seeing the note his father never sent. Then she plugged in the flash drive. There was a pause in the room, almost reverent, as the folders appeared on screen. She clicked through the evidence, Megan's voice, her words, her plan, her threat. The mediator looked up and asked one question. Were you aware that your daughter recorded statements of legal manipulation? Megan's expression cracked for the first time. She stammered. She said Ava didn't understand context, that a 12-year-old shouldn't be trusted with matters this serious. But it was too late. The words existed. The proof had weight. And Jacob, silent all this time, didn't deny a thing. The mediator closed the folder gently. Then, in the same neutral tone she began with, she confirmed the trust was legally sound, there were no grounds to contest it. Ava remained the sole beneficiary under the terms David and I set. Megan didn't say another word. She stood and walked out. Her heels echoed like a ticking clock that had just run out of time. Jacob stayed seated for a moment longer, then rose without looking at me. I didn't chase either of them. I sat there as the room settled into silence again. Not victorious, not angry, just steady. Because sometimes justice isn't loud. It just arrives, calm and undeniable. And that day it did. Ava turned 18 last Friday. She showed up at my front door just after lunch, holding the envelope I had written for her 5 years ago. It was still sealed, still creased where I folded it with shaking hands, and she said she wanted to read it with me. We sat in the living room, the same place where so many truths had landed before. She opened the letter slowly, like it might disappear if she rushed it, and read every word in silence. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. When she finished, she hugged me so tight I could feel the weight lift off both of us. She whispered that she had filed for a legal name change. Her new middle name would be Coraline. I laughed and cried all at once, not because it was grand, but because it was hers, a quiet way to say, I choose you. She told me she didn't want her identity tied to silence or shame. She wanted it tied to truth. That afternoon, we went to her graduation. She walked across the stage with her shoulders straight and head high. When they called out her full name, Ava Coraline Whitman, she looked at me in the crowd and smiled. Jakob was there too. He sat alone in the back row, his suit wrinkled, his hands folded in his lap. He clapped when she crossed the stage, but his eyes stayed on the floor. He didn't come over afterward. Didn't try. No one mentioned Megan. Not once. By then, her absence felt more honest than any explanation could have been. She had become background noise to a story she tried to rewrite and failed. That night, Ava brought her suitcase upstairs. She told me her college roommate had backed out, and she wanted to live here with me for her first semester. I cleared out the guest room like it was a sacred space. Before bed, I tucked her in like I used to, just for old time's sake, she said. And as I closed the door, I whispered the same thing I had whispered to David's photo on the wall. She's going to be okay, love. We're going to be okay. And for the first time in years, I meant every word.